So, after that I started, speeding through some of the other mumbo jumbo to get to more of these prophet stories. And I got to the story, there are others, and there are some stories in the Bible that are not PG rated, period. They're not rated for talking anywhere. You would need an 18 and up ID card to be able for me to even tell you these stories. So the one that intrigued me, that caught my attention the most, was of my most beloved story in the Bible, and that was of David and Goliath. That was my most intriguing story to me, because not only was, it said that in the Bible that David was a very small man and Goliath was a very big man, and that was appealing to me because I've always been very short, and as a kid I was really short. So, I said this was a very beautiful story to me, just in its prose and in its concept of overcoming. And so I started to read about David. And there are very beautiful stories about David in the Bible. There are indeed. But there is one story about David in the Bible that shocked me to my core. And it's a story about three people. There's three people in this drama: David, Bathsheba, and Uriah. And it says that David saw this woman named Bathsheba. And she was one of the most beautiful women of her time. And she happened to be married to one of the commanders of his army named Uriah. But David on this day decided that he was not able to resist his temptation to be with this woman Bathsheba, so he did. And he committed adultery with her. And knowing that he did this, the way that he decided to cover it up was he sent a letter to the generals of his army saying that when the battle was fierce, for everyone to pull back and abandon Uriah, so that he would be killed, and when he dies, then he could have Bathsheba, no harm, no foul. So David went from being the slayer of Goliath, the hero from man, to an adulterer, a plotter, and a murderer. And so this is when I really caught myself and said, hold on now. Something's wrong here. Something's got to give. I said, because to me, God's prophets in my mind were people of example. People who I could follow as an example. Someone who was supposed to be the best of us, so that we could follow them and emulate them. And they're turning out to be worse than some of the people that you see on America's Most Wanted. David is somebody that, if I only knew this about him from the Bible, I see him coming down the street, I'm going the other way and calling 911, because he has to have a warrant out on him for something. This is what I'm thinking in my mind. This man is not an honorable man at all. He killed Goliath, yeah, but he killed this other guy named Uriah to be able to commit adultery with his wife. So I committed the cardinal sin in Christianity. I started asking questions. This is the one thing you do not do in Christianity, is you don't ask questions, especially not about issues like this. So I went to my pastor and I started asking questions. What's going on here? Pastor, there's a very bad recurring habit about these men in the Bible. What is the deal here? And I remember he told me the same thing that almost every pastor or every evangelist or anyone I talked to about this, same answer, almost like it was programmed. They would put their hand on my shoulder and say, Brother Joshua, don't let a little bit of knowledge wreck your faith, because you're not justified by knowledge, you're justified by faith. And they would quote me verses like, lean not on understanding, Paul's, we're justified by faith in Jesus Christ. They would quote this whole line of thing to me like it was already pre-programmed, that they programmed in pastor school that people are going to ask you questions and here's the answer. So I said to myself, I don't know, Pastor, this just seems kind of odd. He said, let me tell you something. What you're reading is the Old Testament referring to God's covenant with the children of Israel. And they were a different people, a very stubborn, crazy people. So why don't you move on to the New Testament? In the New Testament, you'll find the new covenant that we're under with Jesus Christ, and I promise you things will change and be better. I said, okay, perfect. So I went ahead and finished and got to Malachi and then started with the New Testament. So I opened the New Testament and I said, here we go. Let's start all over again. But there were a few things that I had learned from the Old Testament that I wanted to keep in mind when I started to read the New Testament. I learned, number one, that God was one in a unique sense. This is what I learned from the Old Testament, that God was one in a singular, unique sense. This is over and over and over and over very clearly in the Bible. God's nature is one. This is so clear through the Old Testament. and that he was very jealous about his worship. And every single time the children of Israel would turn to something else other than him, he would punish them and restrict their lifestyle. This is something that I learned. And it kind of, the similitude to me with how God dealt with the children of Israel was, and I hate to use this stark contrast, but it's almost as if one of us went out, God forbid, I hope not, and let's say we went out here and robbed a bank. You rob a bank, you're going to jail for a long time. And every day when you wake up, do you think that that jail is going to look like the Hilton at LAX? No, I doubt it. It's probably dark, cold, bad food, orange jumpsuits, not nice people, the whole 9 yards. And the reason why this is, and I know this now from studying psychology, is that this is supposed to be a stark reminder every single day when this person wakes up that you are in jail. This is supposed to remind them every single day you're in jail because you committed a crime. And we run this, not you. This is the message that is being portrayed to this person in jail. So when the children of Israel kept rebelling against God, he restricted their lifestyle. If you study Judaic law now, it is some of the most strict religious law you can find. All of the good things that we enjoy as Muslims, even when it comes to dietary laws, like the good parts of the meat that we are allowed to eat, they can't have these things. These are things that are restricted from them. Why? Because God, Allah, wanted to remind them every day that I am Allah. I am your God. You will worship me. I run this, not you. And I understood this from reading the Old Testament. This is a concept I had come across. So I started with the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And one other thing that I did when I started to read the Bible was, if you go to Barnes & Noble, let's say you go to Barnes & Noble and you take a book off the shelf. What is usually the first thing you look at? The title. Then the next thing, the author. You want to know the title and the author. What is the name of the book? Who wrote it? And if you do this test with every single book of the Bible, you get a title and no author. Author unknown. Or author is appears to be so-and-so. Or we derive that so-and-so possibly written this. You know, like let's just say for Exodus, they say Moses wrote Exodus. Which if you read some of Exodus, he couldn't have written all of Exodus because the last part of Exodus is Moses' death, burial, and Joshua taking over the children of Israel. And now, unless Moses was a sure indeed prophet that was able to write things after he died, then he did not write these things. And so when you go to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, I wanted to know Matthew who, Mark who, Luke who, John who, because it's called the Gospel according to Matthew. The bad thing is that no one knows. No one knows because no one penned their name down to these things. No Bible scholar in his right mind will tell you that we know for sure Matthew so-and-so wrote this, Mark so-and-so wrote this, Luke so-and-so wrote this, John so-and-so wrote this. It's factual information that we do not know who wrote these. So I was intrigued. I'm like, that doesn't, why would somebody write this book that's supposed to be passed down over generations and people are supposed to, this is the inspired word of God to guide mankind, and nobody decided to pin down who wrote it. But anyway, I started to read it, and I started to notice things about the teachings of Jesus Christ. And they were not what I had learned in church. When Jesus spoke, he spoke of the nature of God. And when he spoke of the nature of God, it was the same nature of God that I found in the Old Testament. Jesus said many times that God is one. God is unique. He would even quote from the Hebrew Scriptures. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is but one. When he was asked, what is the greatest commandment? He was asked the greatest commandment. He said the greatest commandment, and every Muslim should understand these two concepts. This should be nothing new to you. The greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your might, with all your strength, and then to love your neighbor as you love yourself. He said the rest hang on these two, which we know in Islam we have rights of the Creator and rights of the creation. So this was the concept that he was teaching. And he even said in 1 John 5:17, and this was more clear to me than anything else can be, this is life eternal, that they may know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ whom you have sent. And when you look at that in the Greek and the Aramaic, it is almost exactly to a T of La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah. Now that I know Arabic and have understood that, very same similar statements. Yes, indeed, there were some implicit statements about that you could implicitly, if you took them and separated them from everything else, you could maybe derive that Jesus was trying to claim some divinity or something for himself. But I also know from doing psychology, and I did a little bit of law too, that an implicit statement cannot override an explicit statement. An explicit statement always takes precedence. So if Jesus said God is one, and he anagorically may have alluded to God being more than one, then the clear statement overrides that each and every single time. So this is what I found through the New Testament. And I also found that Jesus taught salvation. But his salvation that he taught was obeying God and following the commandments. This was his mode of salvation. One man asked him, "Good master, tell me how I can inherit the eternal life." He said, "Follow the commandments." Follow the commandments. He even, in Matthew, was so sincere about it. He said, "Whosoever shall follow the least of these commandments and teach men to do so shall be called the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. But whosoever shall break the least of these commandments and teach men to do so shall be called the least in the kingdom of heaven." So this I understood very clearly, that Jesus taught the same nature of God that was in the Old Testament. He taught that the salvation lied in worshiping God and following the commandments. This I understood. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were very clear about this. There were other things, the only begotten Son, but these things were not in red letter, so I did not give them as much weight as what I did to the actual words that Jesus Christ was saying out of his own mouth. So I read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. All of it was saying the same to me. I said, and I was thinking to myself, this is not what I was taught about Christianity. You're taught that God is 1 in 3, 3 in 1. 1 equals 3. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Jesus died on your cross to forgive your sin. And there was another thing that I noticed from the Old Testament, and this is a beautiful lesson to Muslims, because you're asked this all the time, especially when it comes to dawah. And I never put 2 and 2 together until I learned Islam and then read the Bible one more time. Is I wanted to know why the Jews wanted to crucify Jesus so bad. Why so bad? They could have just mobbed him anywhere and killed him on the street. It's not like he had clans like the Arabs that would have come and backed him up. I said, why didn't they just kill him? Why were they so strict and sincere to tell Pontius Pilate, you got to kill him and you need to sanction it? We can't do it, but you need to sanction it to kill him. And now I understand it. Was that Jesus had a mission, and that mission was to share God with the world. And Paul even kind of tells on himself in his book of Galatians as to why Jesus was meant to be crucified, or the Jews wanted to crucify him. Paul said that the crucifixion is the stumbling block for the Jews. And he explained in Galatians that Jesus Christ, and this is how he tried to roundabout explain it, was cursed for us, to remove us from the curse of Allah by taking this curse upon us. For it is written, and he quoted the Old Testament, everything that hangeth on a tree is cursed. So I went back and studied the Old Testament and Judaic law, and I realized that people who were crucified, that was considered a curse upon them. You had to do something pretty serious to get crucifixion, because it was considered a curse from God. It was part of their law that when someone is crucified, that person is cursed. So wherever they buried these criminals, like in the graveyards in Israel, in Jerusalem, in Palestine, where they buried these criminals that were crucified, this was considered cursed ground. This was considered ground that you didn't go on, and you did nothing here, because these people are cursed by God. So I started to put 2 and 2 together. That it's not that they wanted to kill Jesus, because they could have just killed him. They wanted to disprove who he was. This was their point, was to disprove who this man was. He said he's the Messiah. They wanted to disprove it, and they knew if you can crucify Jesus, he can't be the Messiah. He cannot be our Messiah if you can crucify him. And even if he is, if we can still force our crucifixion on him, then that'll detriment his message. So they understood this and knew this, and this is why they wanted to crucify him. And this is exactly why Allah saved him from it. Because everyone asks you, why did Allah save him from the crucifixion? Because you cannot crucify. That was part of his law that he came to fulfill, that he could not be cursed according to this law. He said, I have come to fulfill the law. To fulfill it. Therefore, he couldn't be cursed according to it. And this is why he went to the Garden of Gethsemane and asked God to remove this from him, because he knew how detrimental this was to his message of crucifixion. So I began to see all of these things. So I started to read, I got to the book of Acts and started to read the writings of Paul the Apostle. And things went from this to this.